The sun rolled over the prairie like a golden tide, spilling warmth across the endless grasslands and long shadows against the rugged fences. Colt Walker stood tall against that backdrop, his hat tipped low, his broad shoulders carrying both strength and solitude. For all the expanse of his land, his house felt like a hollow shell. Built wide and sturdy, it should have been filled with life, the sound of boots clattering down hallways, the laughter of children chasing dogs through the kitchen, the steady hum of a woman's voice calling everyone to supper. But inside, there was none of that. There was only the creak of floorboards, the groan of wind against the shutters, and the heavy silence of a man eating alone. Colt was a cowboy who had worked hard enough to earn everything he had. Acres of cattle, barns filled with hay, strong horses bred for the land. Yet each day ended the same way, him sitting at his oak table, a plate of overcooked meat or beans, boiled until flavorless in front of him. He ate mechanically, without joy, without taste. Food was just fuel. When he laid his fork down, the silence always deepened, pressing down on him until the loneliness felt almost physical. It was in those moments that his size, his towering frame, felt less like strength and more like a burden too heavy to bear. He told himself he didn't need anyone, that he had chosen this life. But each night, when he stared at the empty chair across from him, the truth gnawed at him like hunger itself. What good was a full ranch if the house remained empty? The thought lingered long enough that one morning, with the stubbornness only a cowboy could muster, he rode into town and pinned up an advertisement. His words were plain: cook wanted for ranch, must be honest, hard-working and able to live in. He told himself it was about the food. That was safer than admitting what he really wanted. Someone who could breathe life back into the walls of his home. 2 weeks later, the stagecoach rolled in, carrying a woman who would change everything. Clara Evans stepped down from the wagon, her carpetbag clutched tight in her hand. She wasn't young in the way girls were. She had lines at the corners of her eyes, and her hands bore the proof of years of work. But she carried herself with quiet dignity, a strength that seemed to grow from her very bones. Her dress was plain, her shoes dusty, but her eyes, tired though they were, held a glimmer of determination that refused to be snuffed out. She was a widow, though Colt didn't know it yet. Her husband had been taken from her suddenly in a farming accident, leaving her with no children, no land, and little security. Grief had nearly swallowed her whole, but necessity had pushed her forward. When she saw the ad, she took it as a chance at survival. What she didn't expect was the man who would be standing at the edge of the street to meet her. Colt dwarfed everyone around him. He stood so tall, she wondered if the sun itself might bend around his shoulders. His voice was low when he greeted her, carrying the gravel of years of silence. "You're the cook?" he asked, as if testing the words in his mouth. "I can cook," Clara replied softly, gripping the handle of her bag tighter. "And clean. And keep things in order. That's what a home should be." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Home. Colt hadn't spoken that word in years. For a moment he felt it burning in his chest, both painful and hopeful. He gave a single nod, stepped aside, and gestured toward his wagon. "Kitchen's yours, then." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Colt was a man of few words, and Clara, wary and careful, didn't press. She stared at the horizon, the wide expanse of land stretching in all directions, and wondered if she had just stepped into something too big for her. But when the ranch house came into view, its tall, proud frame standing against the prairie sky, she reminded herself that it was either this or nothing, and she could not afford nothing. That evening, Clara unpacked her few belongings and tied on an old apron she had folded neatly in her bag. The kitchen was dusty, its shelves nearly bare, except for sacks of flour, beans, and dried meat. She set to work with a focus born of habit, moving with quiet efficiency. Butter hissed in a pan as onions softened, their scent filling the air. She kneaded bread, her hands strong and sure, then set it to bake in the oven, while a pot of stew simmered low and steady on the stove. Colt sat in the corner of the kitchen, mending a piece of tack he didn't really need to fix. His eyes kept straying from his work to her. There was something almost soothing in the way she moved, the way she tested the broth with a spoon, adjusted the seasoning, then hummed quietly under her breath as she stirred. For years, his kitchen had been silent, filled only with the scrape of utensils and the clatter of plates. Tonight, it felt alive. When Clara finally placed the meal in front of him, she didn't sit down. She stood across the table, hands folded, waiting. Colt looked down at the bowl of stew, the golden crust of bread, then back up at her. "Go on," she said gently. "Taste it." He hesitated only a moment before lifting the spoon. The first bite nearly undid him. Rich flavors filled his mouth, beef tender, vegetables soft but not mushy, broth seasoned with care. He hadn't tasted food like this in years, and he couldn't remember the last time he felt such warmth spread from his stomach to his chest. He took another bite, slower this time, closing his eyes to savor it. When he finally set the spoon down, his gaze caught hers. He hadn't meant to speak, but the words tumbled out anyway. "I ate the food. Now I crave the cook." Clara's lips parted, her cheeks coloring, but she said nothing. For a heartbeat, the room was suspended in silence, heavy, with something unspoken. Colt shifted in his chair, realizing what he'd admitted. He hadn't planned to let her see that part of him. Not so soon, not ever. But there it was, the truth laid bare in clumsy words. The air between them softened after that. He finished the meal, and she finally sat across from him, nibbling at her own bread. They spoke in halting sentences. About the ranch, about the weather, about her way of making stew without wasting much. Little by little, the conversation grew easier, more natural. And by the time the last plate was cleared away, something unexplainable had begun to take root, quiet but strong, like the first green shoot pressing up through the soil after a long winter. That night, Colt lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the taste of her cooking still lingering on his tongue. But more than the food, it was her presence he couldn't shake. The way she filled the house with movement, the way her eyes met his without fear. For the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, the silence inside him could be broken. Clara Evans had not expected the quiet of the prairie nights to feel so heavy. During the day, she kept herself busy, kneading dough, chopping vegetables, scrubbing surfaces until they gleamed, humming under her breath as she worked. But when the sun sank low and the house slipped into stillness, her thoughts grew louder than she wished. She would lie awake in the narrow bed Colt had given her, clutching the little locket that held her late husband's picture. Sometimes she opened it, tracing her finger over the worn image, whispering his name as if the night itself might carry it back to him. Guilt curled around her like a second blanket. Each time Colt looked at her with that quiet tenderness, each time her heart skipped against her ribs, she wondered if she was betraying the man she had buried. Colt, too, wrestled with his own unease. He was not a man who had ever been smooth with words, and loneliness had made him even rougher around the edges. Each evening at the table, he wanted to tell her how much she meant already, how her laughter filled cracks in the house he hadn't realized were there, how he slept easier knowing she was just down the hall. But he feared it was too soon. She was a widow, still raw with loss. He didn't want to push, didn't want to break something fragile. So he spoke sideways, complimenting her bread, nodding with approval when she organized the pantry, lingering just a little longer in the kitchen while she worked. He hoped she could feel what he couldn't yet say. The prairie itself had a way of testing people, and that test came one night when a storm rolled in fierce and fast. Dark clouds swallowed the horizon, lightning flashing like the sky was being torn apart. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the shutters, until Clara wondered if the whole house might lift from its foundation. Colt's jaw tightened as he stood by the window, his eyes scanning the barn in the distance. When the crash of a branch splitting under thunder echoed across the land, he cursed under his breath. "They'll spook," he muttered, already shrugging into his coat. Before Clara could ask, he was out the door, swallowed by the storm. Her heart leapt to her throat. She could hear the frantic whinnying of horses carried on the wind. Without stopping to think, she grabbed her shawl and ran after him, the rain soaking her in seconds, her skirt tangling around her legs. The barn was chaos. Horses reared and kicked, eyes wide with panic, hooves striking the wooden walls like hammers. A section of the roof had caved in where a branch had fallen, letting the rain pour inside. Colt moved like a force of nature himself, his massive frame steadying the animals one by one, his voice a low rumble that somehow cut through the thunder. Clara, breathless and shaking, darted to his side. "You shouldn't be here," he shouted over the storm, water streaming from his hat brim. "And leave you out here alone?" She shot back, grabbing a bucket to scoop water away from the flooded corner. "Not a chance.